Well, welcome to the One Theophilus podcast. We are going to be doing something a little bit different. We're going to be revamping the One Theophilus podcast, as it will no longer be just myself as always the host, but want to do something different, and that is bring in our good friend Preston. Preston has been a guest on the previous episodes of the One Theophilus podcast, and he and I have been talking and decided we wanted to do something that would resurrect that or bring that back, but in a different format. And so I think everybody is familiar with Preston, but Preston, it's great to see you again.
Great to see you, Troy. Good to be here. I guess we are now two Theophili.
Theophili, that's right. Yeah. Bearded brothers in blue shirts. How about that?
Even better.
So Preston and I were talking. Preston, kind of give us an idea of what some of the things we were talking about, kind of what we want our focus to be going forward.
Well, you had mentioned some things regarding just topics, various things that we could talk about, and wanting to be consistent on a couple of things. But one of the things that we want to be consistent on is having an encouraging perspective on whatever we are talking about, even if it's bad news in the world or whatever.
So. Yeah. So you can take bad news and you can still find something encouraging in it, because there's always going to be bad news. But we want to try to focus on not only current events, but also things happening in the church, things that are having to do with Scripture. So it'll be a various amount of topics that we're going to be talking about. In fact, we also welcome any of your comments or anything. So if you have a topic, something that you would like for us to cover, we would love to do that. Now, let me just say, one of the key things about why we want to do this podcast this way is because Preston and I have known each other now for quite some time now. We have a relationship that goes back at least 15 years, from all the way back to about 2009, I think, or before that, actually, before that. Because I was in school whenever we met. Yep. And so we've got a long history together, and so I really think that we'll be able to bring some encouraging things and some enlightenment to several Bible topics. So today, I think what we want to start on, and what you and I have talked about, is that we want to talk about church planting. And the key reason for that is because you and I have been involved in a church plant. And it's a story that we haven't shared that much in a format like this, but we think that there's a lot of information there that would be very valuable to the church.
Right. So you preach for the Margaret Street Church of Christ in Milton, Florida. I preach 5 miles down the road for the Avalon congregation. And the Avalon congregation was planted by the Margaret Street congregation in November of 2017. So both of us were deeply involved in that. Obviously, we took part in that. And so I think that it's a great topic because of our experience, but we also want to encourage other people. We want to encourage other congregations to consider doing the same thing.
Absolutely, and I think it's one of those things that I think every Christian who is mature in the faith wants to do and wants to be involved in, and certainly understands it, but doesn't really know how, or doesn't have the opportunity to, or just doesn't know much about it. And really, the Bible, even though we see church plants in there, the Bible doesn't give us a list or a plan of how to do it.
There's no set template, so to speak.
Exactly. Yeah. So why don't you take us back to the inception of this idea with Margaret Street wanting to plant a church?
Okay, so I guess maybe we could preface this by saying that again, what you just said, there's no set way to do this. It looks different, and I don't know, different congregations do it differently. So when we tell our story, we're not saying that this is the only way to do it or the way to do it. So it goes back really before I was a preacher here at Margaret Street. I came on board in 2006.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask.
Yeah, I came on board in 2006. But a couple of years after I was here, I learned that in 2003, there had been a discussion, a planning meeting, kind of a vision for the future, which involved planting a church. So I had to kind of get caught up, and so that's kind of where it started. I think that there were some deacons, some of the elders. They were studying out this idea of church planting, and ultimately it resulted in Avalon. So a lot of things in between, including you coming on board and taking part in this.
Yeah, in fact, I think that was one of the one of the thoughts that went into it was, so just a quick history for those of you who don't know my part of this is 2007, I decided to go to Bible school, and I got a phone call from this congregation that said they were looking for a missionary. They heard that I was interested in going on the mission field, and so that started the relationship. And then in 2009, I came here to get acquainted with the congregation, my wife and I lived here for 6 months, and then we went into the mission field in South America on behalf of this congregation.
So I think that we need to pause there and emphasize what you just said. You spent, 6 months? Is that what it was?
6 months here.
6 months at Margaret Street as, I guess, missionary in residence or whatever that's called. I don't know. But you guys got to know the congregation got to know you, which was a great thing as far as our relationship with our missionary. You don't see that a lot of times.
That's right.
You know, congregations typically, they'll just send out money to some guy that comes through maybe once a year or once every few years. But the congregation built a relationship with you,
yes,
which is integral and key to the way that the whole thing played out regarding the church.
Yeah, that's a great point. I forgot about that aspect of it, because that is one of the things where all this focus came from. So one of the things about Margaret Street that was very different from all the other mission supporting congregations that I'd been associated with is, instead of what we'd call a shotgun approach, it was more of a rifle approach. In other words, they wanted to focus in on one missionary and put all their efforts in that one missionary, and him, or the team, the wife and the missionary, I guess we're both missionaries.
Right.
That they be the main missionary and they be the supporters. And so that was one of the things they said. It's like, we want to be your primary supporter, and you're going to be our missionary. And so the whole idea and the first thing you have to do is come be a part of this congregation so that we know Troy and Andrea, and Troy and Andrea knows the congregation. And that is what forged the relationship that eventually turned into the request for Andrea and myself to come back and be what they said at the time would be the evangelist for the church plant that they had been working on for several years. So that's another little part of the history I knew about. Like you, when I came on board, I knew that Margaret Street wanted to plant a church, and they were working in that direction.
Yeah, so there was a lot of, obviously, praying and planning, and then I guess what you would call fanning, the idea of fanning the flame and trying to keep this idea. Because again, between the initial meeting and the time I came on board, there were several things that had taken place, and so there was a kind of a loss of focus. I came on board, and then there was a period of growth. We did some remodeling of the church building, added a balcony, and the idea, by the way, was fill up the balcony. So we had to evangelize, fill up the balcony, and then send that size group out with the church plant.
Because we had the blessed opportunity, or the blessing, I should say, of the congregation just kept growing and growing and growing.
Yeah. And then we got to where we were somewhat root bound, as one person described it.
I love that description.
Yeah.
So let's pause right there a second. Let's talk about that, root bound.
Yeah.
So what do you mean by that?
As far as going any further, from what I understand, before I came on board, and then throughout the time of my preaching here, we stayed pretty consistently around the 240 to 260 mark. Mm-hmm. There was a period of time where we were hitting 300, or right underneath it,
which is capacity here.
Which is exactly, it's capacity, and so there were days when people would come in and see that there was no room, and they would leave. We were having to chase visitors down to keep them. So I mean, it was obvious the time would come when a decision had to be made. Either you're going to have to do something else with the facilities, we're going to have to grow larger, be a mega church idea, not necessarily a mega church, but a larger church, or plant. And the decision had already kind of been thought out and planned ahead that the idea was to plant. Why not? And it had to do with surface area. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so I think that's a great... So let's just say this. So there's a lot of terms that were thrown out that I think are very valuable, and you and I have talked about them much, which is why we keep going to these and explaining. And one of those is a term that was used for this idea of the church plant called surface area. And essentially what it means is that you're just providing more opportunity to be able to evangelize. And I think you had told me that you saw an analogy where if you take a glass of water and you have big chunks of ice versus small crushed ice, you actually can cool the water down quicker.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing as if you have more people and more places for people to come in contact with the gospel, then you're going to bring souls to the foot of the cross faster, quicker, just like cooling down water. So the idea of surface area at first may seem a little like, well, I don't get that or understand it, but it works. And let me explain why. Because now there are two congregations, the Avalon congregation and the Margaret Street congregation. And if you were, over the time that we've been doing this, were to bring all the souls back together, they would not fit in the building. Going back to this idea of root bound, you take away that root bound and you give it which is such a great term because it's like constricting. And now you have this open area, surface area. Exactly.
And it's proven to be true. So you have, once the plant took place, and you can talk about this, and we'll talk about this, the idea that there was a void left at Margaret Street that had to be filled. So Margaret Street had to work, and obviously we, as a new plant, we have to survive, so we're going to have to work, we're going to have to evangelize. And so now you've got two congregations heavily focused on evangelism, on growing the kingdom. And so the idea works. It just does. So root bound, it would have constricted growth. It would not have allowed us to move any further. So surface area is where we went to, and it's proving to be successful. And by the way, this has obviously been done before. We can go back to the New Testament. You know, it's been done. Planting churches, this is nothing new. But I think even in our own somewhat recent history, we can see areas in our own country where church planting was a typical thing. And you can drive through certain counties, I think, in Alabama and see, a Church of Christ on just about every corner.
Right.
So that was the result of people going out and planting churches.
Which is why we're having this conversation, because it is a biblical principle that you see churches being planted. I mean, it's even called that. He says, I planted, Apollos watered, and God gave the increase. And over you see that planting idea. And as you said, it's not something new. In fact, Margaret Street is a church plant itself from a congregation right down the road from back in the 60 to 70 years ago, congregation that planted this one. And then Margaret Street has also planted other congregations in times past, as well as there are other congregations out there. For example, in this process of Margaret Street wanting to plant a church, one of the things they did was go and talk to some other congregations who had been planting churches.
Right.
You want to tell us about that?
Yeah, I wasn't a part of the team that went, but we had, I think it was 2 elders and 2 of the deacons went on a trip to a congregation in Missouri that had planted churches before and just got an idea. Just asked questions, kind of saw what they did, and came back and kind of reported that, and we talked about how we could implement certain things. So kind of like a survey trip, on the mission field. It was a survey trip to figure out exactly what could be done, which also, by the way, says something about the leadership at Margaret Street. You had 2 elders and 2 deacons going. Leadership has to be not only on board, they have to be leading this thing.
That's right.
So one thing that we didn't clarify was that we're not talking about a church split. We're not talking about a church starting because a group of people at one congregation couldn't get along. That's not what we're talking about. This was intentional in order to grow the kingdom. We've already stated that. But it takes the leadership to push this thing through. It has to be out in front of the congregation. The leadership has to have their heads wrapped around it when questions or concerns come up. So it's really important. So I think Margaret Street, again, was blessed with good leadership. They had a vision for this thing. They were out in front. They were keeping it in front of the congregation. And we've talked about, there was pushback. So even keeping it in front of the congregation doesn't mean that you're going to get total buy-in, but at least from the leadership, you do have this out in front perspective of this is the plan, this is what we want to do, and we want to help the congregation not only do it, but help the congregation through it, those that are struggling. So
Like that. In fact, that's one of the key things I want to point out as far as this podcast is concerned. So church planting is so broad, and there's so many aspects to it. There's no way we're going to be able to cover all the details in just one podcast episode. So we will be talking about more details of this in future episodes. But it is something that, again, going back to what we were saying earlier, that you just don't see as often as we should. And I think both of us would agree that this is something that needs to be happening all the time in the United States right now. So my own personal experience as far as church planting, I'm going to back up with that. And then what I like to do is go from there. You kind of touched on some of the challenges. Let's go ahead and talk about some of those. So my own church planting experience happened while I was in the mission field. And what happened with us is we went down as part of a team to build up a congregation that had already been planted. And they were already growing, and we went down there as a second phase to help them grow more mature and continue to evangelize and grow the congregation. And what happened was we had several people coming from another town. And, I mean, one right after another, just a whole group of them over a course of about a year or so. And one of those brothers said, it'd be great if we had a church out here where we live instead of having to drive, because it was a considerable amount of time. It wasn't that far, but it was just traffic and everything. It'd be great if we had a church here. So that sparked the idea, and so I was able to be a part of a church plant. Just kind of, I don't know if I kind of facilitated it, just kind of helped it and everything. Right. Was a part of it as well, but I stayed at the main congregation where I was and then helped them and would go do Bible studies, door knocking, and all those sort of things and get them established. And that congregation is still in existence today. So that was my personal experience with church planting. God provided, and we simply did it. This, however, with Margaret Street, is more of a planned out. It wasn't like people were coming and it's like, we need to plant a church over there,
right,
which is one form of how church planting happens. But this was planned out. And you made a comment just a minute ago. You said this is not a split. Yeah. So elaborate on that just a little bit more.
Okay, so we've had to clarify this from the beginning, because a lot of times when a new congregation begins in a community, sadly, it begins because of there being some sort of disruption in a local congregation. A congregation ends up dividing, splitting. So we wanted to clarify that this was, what we were doing was intentional. We were arguing this biblically. Obviously, we wanted biblical authority for what we were doing, or we wouldn't be doing it. And we honestly believe that this was a way for the church to grow.
Nice.
And our area of the country, obviously Northwest Florida, the Milton Pace community, at the time when this vision was first cast, was growing and is continuing to grow. Mm-hmm. By leaps and bounds, and so there's plenty of room. That was one of the things also. We wanted to make sure that this was clearly understood. It was not going to be a split. It was not a split. And also we wanted buy-in, or at least understanding from other congregations in the area.
Yes.
We weren't going to be in competition with other churches.
Yes.
There are plenty of souls to go around, and we want to grow the kingdom. That's the emphasis here.
Absolutely. And I think that is one of the, so that brings us into, we'll elaborate on this more, that brings us into several other concerns that came up from that trip that was made up to those congregations that were, that had planted churches. So we had a lot of questions. And I think one of the first questions was, well, what about the money? That seems to be the first one. We're going to lose all those people who, those contributions. The second one was, well, what about, the doctrine? And then just question after question after question. And one of the key things that kept coming up and was still an issue even at the time Avalon was planted was what you said is like, well, you're planting in our backyard, or you're going to take away opportunities. And as you said, in fact, I just read an article that says Milton has surpassed the 10,000 residents for the first time in history.
Wow.
And the Pace and Pensacola area, I mean, everywhere you look, there are new houses. So there are more than enough souls. And that leads into another question that comes along with that as well. why don't we just go build up one of these struggling congregations instead of planting a church? Because that is one of the first things, seems like one of the very first things that people say when you start talking about church planting.
Yeah. So there's an acknowledgement that there are congregations. This is happening everywhere. It's always happened, but there are congregations that are dying or that are struggling. And so it's a legitimate question. Why not just go in and do that? You know, there may be a place for that, a ministry for that, but my personal concern was if we sent a group from our congregation into another congregation that was small and struggling, that's going to look like a hostile takeover. And that's, it wouldn't be hostile, but it by its very nature, it would be a takeover.
It's going to be a takeover because things are going to change.
You're bringing in a different culture, a different group of people. And I don't know that would be a good there would be a good result. I'm sure that it has happened, but that wasn't our goal.
Right.
You know, and it's been suggested though that when a church is planted, church planting actually encourages congregations that are struggling. And a lot of times those congregations are struggling as a result of just being at a particular place for a lengthy amount of time, growth not happening like it probably should, or whatever struggles take place. But what the new plant does is it almost invigorates or encourages the struggling congregation to kind of maybe step up and let's try something different.
Yes.
Let's do some things, because we get stuck in our ways.
Exactly.
And I'm not saying do anything unscriptural. I'm just saying, you know the stories about churches, a preacher will come in and have an idea for a ministry or whatever, and they'll say, we tried that 45 years ago and it didn't work. So people get stuck in their ways. They don't want to try something different. So church planting just by another congregation in the area can actually encourage that. So anyway.
Yeah, let's be real. Let's be honest. I mean, because those who are listening to this podcast, we're hoping that this will be useful. One, thinking about church planting, but also if you're considering church planting, these are some things you're going to have to deal with. And the reality is, as you're talking about getting stuck in your ways, is that sometimes there won't be a change. There won't be any more growth. And sometimes that happens because of history. You have family history. You have community history. There's all kinds of factors that play into it. And by no means do we want any of those congregations to perish or go away. We want to see more congregations, but I really think it's kind of like the way you describe that kind of reminds me of baseball or sports or whatever, because, sometimes I'm trying to think of the two, Sammy Sosa and, I can't think of his name, Mark or McGuire, yes, thank you. I think those two had such a great career because the two were competing. And not that there's any competition between lighthouses, but they helped encourage, because now you can see, and I think that's the key of what you were saying.
Yeah, you push each other in a good way.
Yes, because that's still happening at Margaret Street and Avalon, because we are in constant communication.
Yep.
And I believe it's happening in the other congregations too, because they see, okay, it is possible to get more souls. It is possible to grow a church, and that will encourage others to grow as well. At least that's the prayer. And the hope for that.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's get to the end of the story just to make sure that we don't get too bogged down into some of these details, because, man, I love telling these stories.
And we're going to do some more. The next podcast, we'll go right into some more details on this.
Right. So ultimately, I mean, this is where we are now as a result of the planning. We have the Avalon congregation that started. Let's see. We had our final service on a Sunday morning at Margaret Street. Wednesday night, we met at a house. So we met for the first time on a Wednesday night. By the time we met Sunday morning, we had a full-time preacher, a fully functioning eldership, and deacons, along with a membership that was ready to work. So when we launched, we were fully ready. And that happened as a result of all of the planning that had taken place.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to make sure that we get to that point in our discussion of what this looks like. It looks like two fully functioning congregations in a town of now above 10,000 people, and other congregations existing, but the relationship that we have with each other, we're working to grow the kingdom.
That's right.
That's
the bottom line.
That's the point, yeah.
Yes.
And so It's possible. And there were a few, I think, advantages that Margaret Street had. You talked about the money issue, but one of the big advantages that we had, going back to where we kind of started earlier, was the relationship that we had with you.
Yeah.
Because by the time it was decisions needed to be made. Go ahead and tell that story.
Okay.
Regarding preachers.
All right. Yes, because one of the things is that I don't know if you've picked up on this or not, but Preston is the preacher at the church plant.
Right.
And I'm the preacher here at Margaret Street. And we just got through saying I was the missionary and I was looked at as evangelist. And that was the mindset of the eldership whenever they were going through this planning process. And I think maybe even the deacon of missions, who was also key to this
Absolutely.
whole thing.
Yep.
He was involved in missions. That was his main focus, but church planning is missions.
Right.
And so he was also focused in that area and was a key leader in that. So I think the thinking was, well, we got this missionary. We're already supporting him, and we'll then use him to help.
Because it was time for you. You
Yes.
had fulfilled your tenure.
Thank you
and
for reminding
beyond.
me of that.
Yeah.
So, yes, my wife and I had been on the field, and whenever we realized, you know what, it's about time that we need to come back to the States. The whole idea was to leave the congregations there so that they were self-supporting, self-governing, self-propagating, and they were, and they are today. It's been now 7.5 years, and they're still functioning great. So we told the elders we wanted to come home. We were looking to come home. And that's whenever the plan started moving. It's like, okay, well, now we have somebody who we can put into the church plant.
Right. So it was good. So I'm not going to jump ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, but that's exactly it. The idea of one of the scary things, and this is one of the advantages that Margaret Street had, was because we had this relationship with you. It was already a perfect setup. We didn't have to search for a preacher.
Right.
Yeah.
They knew me. They had history with me. They knew they could trust me.
Yep.
And everything. Because as you just mentioned, one of the elements of this church plant was taking members, not only taking members with you. So let's clarify that real quick.
That's
one
good.
of the things that we did was, all right, we want to ask for volunteers to go on this church plant. So we asked the members. And in that, we wanted to make sure we had men who could serve as deacons, and the eldership decided some of them were going to go so that this congregation would have elders.
Right.
Which is just one way of doing it. It's
Right.
not the only way. It's not absolutely necessary, but it is a good, strong, healthy way of doing it to ensure the success.
And doctrinal soundness was of utmost concern, because that was one of the things that was observed when they went on the survey trip. That there was the potential for a church plant to go astray doctrinally without strong leadership or good leadership. So that was of utmost concern. It was almost a prerequisite. Like, the church plant would not happen unless there were sound elders involved in this.
Right.
And obviously, and it was a neat thing. We had to study our way through this. Obviously, you can't have one congregation over another congregation.
They're autonomous.
So they're autonomous. So while we're playing this whole thing out, it's all in a potential scenario. Who is going to be the elders? Mm-hmm. You know, who are they going to be? So anyway.
Yeah. So in that process, who's going to be the preacher? So in that process, they decided or asked if I would do that, and of course, yes, absolutely. Because one of the things is Andrew and I wanted to be in this area because of the relationship we had with Margaret Street. It's like, well, if we're going to come back to the United States, this is where we want to be. And, okay, so here's part of the story that is interesting, is that we had such a good relationship with so many people here. Really, in our hearts, what we really wanted is, like, we'd really like to come back to Margaret Street. But, you know, they got Preston. He's a great preacher, and he is, by the way. And, you know, that's not going to be an option. So, all right, yes, at least we'll be in the Milton area and we'll be near our friends. So then they did a survey. So as we mentioned, they were wanting to ask members of the congregation who's willing to do this. And by the way, that point right there alone, members of the congregation, is a whole other topic that we're going to cover in, I believe, in our next episode. So they did a survey. Who's interested in doing this? And the survey came back that Preston was interested and his wife were interested in going on the church plant. Yep. So tell us why that is, and then we'll continue from there.
I was sold on church planting. I mean, that's what it comes down to. I want to evangelize, and I was sold on this idea. This is it. This is a great way to do it. I know that I'm stepping out with a group of people that I'm confident that will do the work with me.
Yeah.
It was just exciting, man.
Yeah.
And I think you had kind of described that you and Andrea, you had been on the mission field.
Yes.
You had been doing missions for a while.
Yes.
And it would be nice to come back to some stability.
Yes.
And I was ready to launch out, man. It was just perfect timing. And so I in fact, because you were coming to the end of your tenure, that's what kind of was the final spark in us saying, okay, now's perfect timing. We've got the perfect setup, the perfect scenario. We need to do it now.
Wow.
So that was a big part of it. But yeah, the idea. Think about again. You have a leadership, an eldership, allowing members to self-select. So this was not. Let me go back to this too. This was not just a congregation sending out a preaching family to start a new church.
Which is one method of doing church.
Which is a method, right?
Yep.
This is a congregation sending out a group of people.
Yes.
To start a congregation in the local area. So you don't have to. A great benefit of this is that you're not looking for people to relocate to another community.
Yeah.
They stay at home. They're just starting a new congregation. So,
which is another way of doing it.
Right, which is another way of doing it. So there is that comfort. So it was just a good opportunity for us to launch out into something new, something heavily focused on evangelism, and I think that it got your attention because it was giving you stability with Margaret Street.
And so what I'd like to do here is we're going to wrap up this episode with this story.
Yep.
And then take us into the next episode. We'll go into more detail. So, so the elders then contacted us while we were still on the mission field. And it was almost interesting. They said, we got a proposal for you. We don't know that if you would be interested or not and everything. It was almost as if we know that your heart is set on going on church planting, which it was, and I was happy to do because I always pray, even to this day, I pray, Lord, whatever door you open for me, I am your earthen vessel. I use me at your will. And so the elders said, we just found out that our preacher wants to go on the church plant. So would you be interested in being the preacher at Margaret Street? And meanwhile, Andrew and I are poking each other under the table, and we're so excited because, as you mentioned, after 7 years of being on the mission field, which was a wonderful experience, but you're in a third world country, you're away from your family. All I wanted to do was I needed a little bit of stability in my life, and man, to God be the glory. He provided that for me through this opportunity. As one of my good friends says, it was a setup. God set it up. So everything would work. So you would be there, and I would be here, and now we are looking back and very happy. So
absolutely.
Why don't we stop right there, and we want to encourage you to tune into the next episode as we will continue this discussion and probably the next few because it is such, we believe, an important topic that we hope will encourage others or at least get you excited about sharing the gospel and talking to others. And once again, glad to have you here, Preston. I'm
excited.
You're excited. All right. Well, keep your eyes on Jesus. And remember, try to be that Theophilus that we read about in Scripture. We're just one Theophilus and another Theophilus, loving God and being loved by God. And so we hope you'll continue to join us here, and you will have a great day, and God bless.